Behold, the 1970s, a decade of American history like no other. It's a slice of the American pie that's just a bit sweeter than the rest. Yet, somewhere amid that sugar, that slice is bitter. And us Americans today are able to explain why we have such a bittersweet decade in American history. Today, we are able to explain the society of America in the 1970s. An area that the 1970s are best known for is pop culture. If you ask anyone who grew up in the 1970s, they'll tell you all about society's emphasis on pop culture. As for me, I asked my father, Kurt Gittleman, about his experiences growing up in the 1970s. So, tell me what it was like growing up in the 1970s, being exposed to new and exciting forms of fashion and trends.
Yeah, growing up in the 70s, again, was a culmination of what was happening in the late 60s. People's hair were a lot longer, especially the men's and the boys. The dress started to turn a little bit more formal, although the boys and the girls were still wearing jeans and dungarees, but the adults started to get into what was called leisure suits, and people would wear chains around their neck with peace signs. But not everybody was doing that. Myself and my friends didn't necessarily follow the trends, although our hair was pretty long, and by the time I reached high school, my hair was almost down to my shoulders. You know, things were just moving. The fashions, the styles were changing, and then a little past the mid-70s, the music dramatically changed. Everybody's favorite thing was to go out disco dancing. My friends and I, we went out dancing too and hoped to have a good time.
All of the hype from the 1960s went straight into pop culture in the decade after, the 1970s. The hippie culture from the 1960s slowly faded, and in its place came fashion. Bell-bottoms and platform shoes were the in things to wear, and the fabrics of choice were knits, denims, and corduroy. New interesting fads came out and went alongside new fashion, usually in short periods of time. Mood rings, fruit-striped gum, Rubik's Cubes, sea monkeys, and even pet rocks are among the few things you could call trendy in the 70s. Star Wars figurines were also popular among 70s teenagers following the success of the Star Wars movie, and that brings up another change from the 60s to the 70s. Previously, television had become widely popular, causing box office sales to decline. Yet in the 1970s, movies made a sort of comeback, releasing classics that no one would ever forget.
Yeah, the 70s, I'm guessing, was the best decade as far as seeing movies. Some of the best classics were made. Star Wars, Rocky, Godfather, The Exorcist, Jaws were classics that you'll be seeing till the end of time. Rocky, Godfather, classic. The special effects in Jaws and The Exorcist and in Star Wars were incredible. When Jaws came out, it affected people in such a way that people for about 2 or 3 summers were afraid to go in the water. The beaches were they weren't filled because people were scared to death to go into the water. And Star Wars, even today, some of the special effects were incredible.
Even still, many popular television shows aired in the 70s, including The Brady Bunch, Saturday Night Live, Happy Days, and Sesame Street. The 1970s saw the deaths of popular musicians, including Elvis Presley, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Jim Morrison. It was also the time when the Beatles, one of the most beloved bands of all time, broke up. The concept of rock and roll had significantly dwindled down, yet in its place came many subgenres of rock, yielding many new musicians.
The beginning of the 70s was kind of a sad time because some iconic people had passed away. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison of the Doors, and the Beatles had just broken up. But in their wake, there was new artists, Aerosmith, Bee Gees, which was part of the disco era, Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, great artists that were coming in and taking their place and to a new stage in rock and roll. They were great. My friends and myself were listening to Bruce Springsteen, Led Zeppelin, Elton John, Billy Joel. There was a resurgence and a new era for rock and roll. It was, like I said, very sad in the beginning, but at the end there was a rebirth and a new beginning. Some of those artists lasted for a great long time. Well, yeah, rock and roll it started to go into hard rock, soft rock, pop rock, alternative rock. There was many different areas that rock took off, and there was something for everybody.
The athletic and artistic sides of the 1970s aren't widely discussed, but they're actually quite interesting. In 1972, the Miami Dolphins had a record-breaking undefeated season in football, and Joe Namath became a standout player. Roberto Clemente got his 3,000th hit in baseball before passing away later, and he became baseball's first Latin American superstar. Successful NBA stars included Julius Erving, Pete Maravich, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird. Art in the 1970s aimed to capture both environmentalist and minimalist ideas in a movement called Earth Art. This movement was prompted by artists like Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson. A different type of art found in the form of comic books flourished in the 1970s and could be seen in comics like The Amazing Spider-Man and The Green Lantern. In the world of architecture, architects aim to consider the needs and feelings of the people who use their buildings. Architects also attempted to add a historical aspect to their buildings, as seen in the pyramid design of the Transamerica building. While education availability for the poor, Indians, handicapped, and other minorities were steadily increasing, two other notable movements were seen throughout schools. These were the goal of integration and anti-war movements. In spite of the overpowering positive outlook of society in the 1970s, these aspects were still notable.
Back into the 70s, regarding integration, they thought this was the best course of action, but the reality is it wasn't, and it caused more problems than they anticipated. I remember growing up, they wanted to integrate, and the problem was they forced busing, which was a disaster because some of my best friends came from the inner city and they were telling me they were forced to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes to take 2 or 3 buses to travel hours and hours to get to school and hours to get home. That in of itself was a big problem. Then you were forcing them to come into other neighborhoods that weren't quite ready. We had racial tensions. There were riots at our schools. Blame sometimes was on both sides. Getting into the anti-war protests, it was a lot of turmoil back then. Anti-government protests going on everywhere, but it filtered down to high school and middle school. And I remember even in middle school, we had sit-ins and demonstrations and picketing. People were carrying signs out on the sidewalk. There was a different form of protest. I look back at it now and laugh. There was something called streaking. It was pretty funny. Students would take their clothes off and run around until they were caught or not caught, and sometimes they got away with it. And I remember one time it happened at our graduation.
Close to the end of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon became president after a bumpy road in his political career. While Nixon had his positive contributions toward society, his record was tarnished by the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal was a series of crimes on political opponents of Nixon and a series of cover-ups of the misdeeds by the president and his staff.
Back in the early 70s, I think it was after President Nixon's first term, everybody agreed that it was going to be a foregone conclusion about who was going to be elected. It was going to be a landslide, and due to his paranoid schizophrenia, he did some illegal things to find out as much as he could to get dirt just because he was paranoid. There was no reason in the world for him to do it, so he had people under him hire some other people that broke into the Democratic Party's offices, and eventually they got caught and they told the truth, and all the while the president was in denial. Well, yeah, he was the first and only president to ever have resigned because eventually he was going to be impeached. You know, the country, it was shameful. I mean, you know, it was everybody questioned and had doubt about the government. Since then, whether it's justified or not, there's been a lack of trust with every administration, every president, whether it's deserved or not deserved. My father just said this is what happens when you are greedy and when you break the law. They talked about it in school. The year I graduated, it was final.
The 1970s are sometimes referred to as the decade in between, as it almost stood alone from the other decades in terms of the fluctuation of society's high and low points. Major trends included a growing disillusionment of the government, advances in civil rights, increased influence of the women's movement, a heightened concern for the environment, increased crime and references of drugs in literature, and increased space exploration. After assessing the information given, it is clear that the 1970s had many ups and downs. Yet that is the exact reason why we today, citizens of America, are able to look back and emerge from the past, from our mistakes, and become the thriving people we are today as we live out our everyday lives.